Okay, sabi ko sa inyo, ilista nyo lang yung mga questions nyo at sasagutin ko isa-isa. So, there is one question I would like to answer now. Ito yung question about FOB or freight on board. Ano ba itong freight on board na to? So, freight on board or FOB, also referred to as free on board. It is an international commercial law term published by the International Chamber of Commerce. It is an international commercial term. So, kasi sa international commerce, yung goods siniship dun sa port, 'di ba? May mga shipping port, meron tayong mga port dito sa atin. Ah, kung saan din dinadala yung or uh, dinadala ng barko yung mga kargamento. So, doon ano yun, doon nanggaling yung FOB shipping ship FOB or freight on board na term na yan. Because nagta-transact yung mga uh, negosyante ng bawat bansa sa iba't ibang bansa. So, meron silang ginagawang mga terms para ma-identify yung transaction or yung liability. So, itong FOB or freight on board or free on board, it is an international commercial law term. Pero ginagamit din natin ito sa ating mga domestic transactions. So, it indicates the point at which the costs and the risks of shipped goods shipped or transferred from the seller to the buyer. So, in modern domestic shipping, the term is used to describe the time when the seller is no longer responsible for the shipped goods and when the buyer is responsible for paying the transportation costs. Ideally, the seller pays the freight charges to a major port or other shipping destination, and the buyer pays the transport costs from the warehouse to his store or vendors. Kasi pagka international trading yan, kunyari, yung Amerika magpapadala sa Pilipinas, port to port yan, di ba? From America, dadalhin yan sa port ng Amerika, ikakarga sa cargo vessel or barko na pang cargo at idadalhin sa Manila. O port to port ang usapan, from the port of America to the port of the Philippines. So usually from the port of America to the port of the Philippines, sino-shoulder na yon ng seller. So, kung from the port of the Philippines, merong mga warehouse dyan. Doon mo na ilalagay yung mga kargamento na yon hanggat di pa kinukuha ng buyer or hindi pa dinideliver ng seller sa buyer. So, usually, hanggang port of Manila, Philippines lang yung isi-shoulder ng seller. Ang mag-shoulder na from the warehouse to the buyer's store or warehouse also will be the buyer. Usually. Pero depende yan sa usapan eh. So, meron tayong tinatawag na FOB shipping point and FOB destination. So, when the terms of business are FOB shipping point, the seller has to deliver the goods to the carrier. Now, the purchaser's responsibility is to pay for the freight and all related costs till it reaches his premises or the required location. So, kung LBC yan, dadalhin lang ng LBC ng seller sa LBC yan. Pero kung ang term ng LBC ay pick up, ay yung pamasahe mula dun sa store hanggang sa LBC, dun na yan sa buyer. Hindi na dun sa seller. Kung FOB shipping point. Now, as soon as the goods are shipped from their origin, their ownership and responsibility is shifted to the purchaser. So, yun yung point where there is transfer of title over the goods. So, kapag ikaw na yung may-ari, ikaw na yung responsible doon for the risk. So, kung mawawala yun, masisira yun, ikaw na responsible. Therefore, yung pag-transport nun, responsibility mo na rin. So, ikaw na rin magbabayad nun dahil ikaw na yung pipili ng paraan para madala mo sa area mo or sa store mo yung goods na binili mo ng maayos at hindi nasisira. So, pag sinabi namang FOB destination, it is when the seller pays the freight charges for the transport of goods to the buyer's desired location. In this case, the ownership of the goods remains with the seller when the goods are in transit. It ships to the buyer only upon delivery of the goods. Katulad ng sinabi natin, yung LBC kanina, nag-deliver LBC. Yung delivery kung pick up yung usapan nun at namasahe yung buyer papunta sa LBC, yung pamasahe ng buyer papuntang LBC, kasama yun sa i-assume na cost ng seller. Kasi ang seller pa rin yung may-ari ng goods hanggat hindi nakakarating sa tamang destination. It may either be the store of the buyer or his warehouse. Saan ba gusto ipa-deliver ng buyer yung kanyang goods? Sa store ba niya or sa warehouse? Hanggat di nakakarating sa store niya or sa warehouse niya, ang may-ari ng goods ay ang seller. Therefore, yung seller ang mag-a-assume ng risk at siya rin ang magbabayad ng cost. So, tandaan nyo, FOB simply means the point wherein there is a transfer of title over the goods. So, kung meron ng transfer of title over the goods, meron na ring shift of responsibility. So, kailan mag-a-assume ng responsibility yung buyer? So, kung FOB, it depends kung anong napagkasunduan nila. Pag sinabing FOB shipping point, doon pa lang sa premise ng business ng seller or doon sa major port kung saan i-deliver ng seller yung goods, meron ng transfer of ownership. Therefore, the buyer becomes liable for the risk and the cost of transporting the goods from the major port to his store or warehouse. Kasi siya na may-ari. Now, FOB destination, the transfer of title over the goods is happens. The transfer happens only when the goods reaches the destination of the buyer. Considering that the seller is still the owner of the goods, from his point or from his place up to the major shipping point and up to the place of the store or warehouse of the buyer, the seller assumes all the transportation expenses. So, nakita nyo ang difference? Nung tatlong salita, FOB shipping point, and FOB destination. So, FOB, that is the point where there is transfer of ownership. Therefore, there is already an assumption of risks and expenses associated with transportation. So, pag sinabing FOB shipping point, dun pa lang sa place ng seller, or dun sa major port kung saan i-deliver ng seller yung kanyang goods, meron ng transfer of ownership. Therefore, the buyer pays for the transportation expenses and assumes the risk in case of damage or loss. Now, FOB destination, it is the place of the buyer, whether it's his store or warehouse. So, hanggat hindi nakakarating dun sa store or warehouse ng buyer, there is no transfer of ownership. Therefore, the seller remains to be the owner and remains to be the owner of the risks and expenses for transporting the goods from his place of business to the place of business or warehouse of the buyer. I hope this clears your question on free on board or FO freight on board or free on board, which which are represented by FOB. So pareho lang yung FOB freight on board at saka FOB free on board. Pareho lang yung term na yun. That is the point where ownership is transferred from the seller to the buyer. Now, who shall bear the transportation expense? It depends on the contract. There are two kinds of contract to this: FOB shipping point and FOB destination. FOB shipping point, the seller assumes the buyer assumes the risks and expenses because the title over the goods is transferred at the point of origin or from the shipping point. Now, FOB destination, the seller pays for the transportation cost and assumes the risk in case of loss or damage while transporting the goods because he remains to be the owner of the goods until it is delivered to the store or warehouse of the buyer.